The reading is Jesus and the miraculous catch of fish. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, We'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, Friends, have you any fish? No, they answered. He said, Throw your net on the other side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large numbers of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, It is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there, with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, Come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, Who are you? For they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Jesus reinstates Peter. And when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, Feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, Take care of my sheep. The third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. Do you love me? He said. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, Feed my sheep, for verily, truly, I tell you, when you were young, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hand, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, Follow me. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answered, If I want to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
Thank you very much, Ralph, and thank you for your introduction, Gerald. And it's very good to be with you, but sadly, as Gerald said, it is our last in the series. And I've really enjoyed doing this series. And although I looked at it, as I say, some years ago, in fact, I've worked through this series again. And of course, there have been many, many new things for me, and I hope some new things for you as well. So congratulations on getting to this stage, the last one of our 7 conversations. And there could have been others if there'd been time, and we'll probably see that there might have been a couple of others as we go through this part of the narrative to do with the crucifixion and the resurrection. But the title we've given to the talk this evening is How Jesus Meets Us After Failure. And the failure, of course, that we're thinking about is the failure of Simon Peter. But in a way, of course, it's something that is germane to all of us who, have failed in one way or another in our lives and need to be put back on track again. But Peter had a very spectacular failure, really, in the public eye when he denied Jesus, as you know, outside the high priest's house at the time of the trial of Jesus, his first trial by the high priest, denied him 3 times. And then, as you know, the cock crew, and he went out and he wept bitterly. And we'll come back to that story a little bit later on. So that's what we'll be thinking about this evening. But I want you to understand that this account from John chapter 21 is really the epilogue to the whole of the gospel. And so I just want to contrast and compare for a moment the prologue, which was at the beginning, as you remember, John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, with the epilogue. Because that is the way in which the gospel has been constructed by John after, no doubt, careful thought and prayer. And we saw the themes that arose out of the prologue at the very beginning of our first session 6 weeks ago, when we thought of the prologue in relation to the miracle at the wedding of Cana of Galilee. And I think I said then, because I've often said it before, that the prologue is really rather like an overture at the beginning of the gospel. And there we find, as it were, the notes, the themes, the phrases of music, so to speak, which are then going to be played right through the gospel to great effect and highlighted by the teaching of Jesus, by his signs, and by all that goes on. So you remembered, of course, in the prologue that Jesus was the Word who was with God and was God, and he became flesh and dwelt among us. He is the one and was the one who brought and brings life, spiritual life, full life, life in all its fullness, we're told in St. John's Gospel, and also light as well. He is the light that cannot be extinguished. Even there, again, the prologue says, men love darkness rather than light and will not come readily to the light to find that light lit in them. And then that hugely important phrase or sentence, which goes like this: to those who received him, that is Jesus Christ, who believed in his name, are given the right to become children of God. And I'll come back to this right at the end, but the whole purpose of the gospel is that we might believe. It's not just to say that's a great story. That's some amazing signs and miracles there. That's an extraordinary thing at the end of the gospel, the resurrection and the crucifixion before it. But the purpose of it all is the Son of Man came into the world that we might believe, and then in believing receive his life, his light. To become children of God ourselves is the purpose of his coming. And again, in the prologue, we're told that God in Jesus manifested his glory, the glory as of the only Son. That glory was partially shown in that first story at Cana of Galilee, but then it comes, as it were, into fullness when Jesus says in John chapter 12, my hour has come. Son, Father, glorify your Son as the Son may glorify you. And that, of course, is to come about in the crucifixion, which we'll look at a little bit this evening, and then the resurrection as well. And again, do you remember at the very beginning, we're told in the prologue that the era of the law, that Moses brought the law, is kind of over. Not that it was bad or anything, it's just that it's been superseded by grace. Moses brought the law, and Jesus Christ has brought grace and truth, not to overthrow the meaning of the law, the purpose of the law, but to supersede it with something even greater. And I just want to, if I may, just read one verse at the end of that prologue and then compare it with the epilogue, which we're looking at this evening, where this very important statement is made by John. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So the claim of the gospel right through from the very beginning is that this man was also divine. And if you've seen him, remember Jesus said to Philip, you have seen the Father. But he is part of the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And in many ways, as I said, I think earlier in this course of conversations, this gospel is the gospel of the Holy Trinity. So that was all in the prologue. And that was the overture to the ministry of Jesus, played out then in the teaching and the signs that will follow on, which we looked at in part as we went through the gospel. And now we come to the very end, the last chapter, John chapter 21, which is the epilogue. And that was quite a customary thing in writing at the time, to have a prologue and an epilogue to something that's going to tell you what's coming, and something at the end is going to sum up and also prepare for the future. And that's what this is. This final chapter is, in fact, the epilogue. And the miracle in it is not one of the 7 signs, which have come to their, as it were, culmination in the raising of Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11. But this is part of the epilogue. It's a miracle, really about the future. And I'll seek to explain that when we get to that miracle in just a few minutes' time. So last week we were considering that conversation, extraordinary conversation between Jesus and Pilate, which fell into 2 parts. And in the middle of it, Jesus was sent out, you remember, by Pilate, and he was flogged by the Roman soldiers, and then he was brought back in. And Pilate wanted him to speak, and Jesus wouldn't speak. And Pilate said, I've got power. And Jesus said, you don't have any power over me except the power that you've been given. And we thought about that. And then Jesus is handed over to the soldiers to be crucified. And this is opportune, isn't it, that we are thinking about these matters in Holy Week, and we'll be thinking about the crucifixion on Good Friday and the events of that time over this week, culminating in the resurrection, of course, on Easter Sunday. Well, Pilate hands him over and he is crucified. And of course, as you know, the New Testament just kind of says factually, he was crucified. Hardly ever goes into the suffering, physical suffering, or what that meant to the victim. Cicero said, the great Roman orator, who said, let not crucifixion come near any Roman citizen. It was a terrible invention by the Romans. It was appalling in its cruelty. And people hung sometimes for days on the crucifix, on the wood, to be crucified, as indeed the slaves were after the great rebellion of Spartacus. You remember they lined the Appian Way from Rome, literally for mile upon mile upon mile of slaves who were crucified either side of the road to make a terrible exhibition of what would happen if you rebelled against Roman authority. It was appallingly cruel. And it was the manner of death that often the Romans used to execute people who they didn't want to be around, or who had been criminals or whatever. Or Jesus suffered crucifixion. As I say, we don't have a lot of, as it were, description of the suffering itself. What we have is a description of some of the events that happened around the crucifixion, which kind of give a sort of poignancy to what is happening as Jesus was crucified. Pilate had resolved that although he couldn't release him from being condemned, which is what he wanted to do, but he was intimidated by the crowd and handed him over, at least he put up this notice above the head of Jesus on the cross. And it read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And many of the Jews were told, read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And it was written in Aramaic, the local language, in Latin, the Roman language, and Greek, the language really of the whole area, the whole region. In fact, it was a notice there for the whole of the Western world that Jesus of Nazareth was the King of the Jews. And the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, didn't like it and said, won't you change that? Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man claimed to be the King of the Jews. And Pilate showed a bit of resolution on this occasion and says, what I have written, I have written. And it stood there for that proclamation on the cross for all time. And then by contrast, Jesus' clothes were taken away from him except for a loincloth. And they were gambled for by the soldiers. And they divided them up amongst the four lots of them. And the undergarment, the seamless woven piece, which was one piece from top to bottom, they did not tear, but they drew lots for it. And one of the soldiers took it away. And ever since then, of course, the Christian church have been wondering what happened to it, where it is, and is it the Turin child, and all of that kind of thing, which I'm not going to speculate on now. But anyhow, one soldier had that seamless robe. And then there is a little conversation here, which I suppose if there had been time, one could have turned into a whole talk, which is that extraordinary conversation between Jesus. It's really an instruction, isn't it? And the Apostle John, who wrote the Gospel, and Mary, his mother. There are four women who are standing close by Jesus as he died. One of whom is Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus, seeing her distress, standing there and seeing her son die, said to the beloved disciple, to John, the author of this Gospel, these words, "Woman, here is your son." And he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that time on, this disciple took her, Mary, into his home. And quite possibly, she went with him when he moved from Jerusalem to Ephesus at some point later after the crucifixion and resurrection. Well, Jesus put them together. It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's rather like his saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," that he had such extraordinary knowledge and empathy for people around him, even though he was suffering beyond our reckoning and understanding, not only physically, but also spiritually. Now, there are two cries that John gives us from the cross. One represents, again, his humanity, his need, and the other, his divinity and his triumph. The former is when he cries out in verse 28, "I am thirsty." Well, he must have been completely and utterly in need of refreshment and water or something to drink. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant and lifted it up to Jesus' lips. And he drank. His final drink, his final earthly drink as a human being, as God in human flesh in that sense. And if that represents, again, his humanity and his suffering, physical suffering, also alongside that is another cry from the cross that John gives us. He doesn't give us all of them, as we know. The other cry is, "It is finished." The single Greek word, tetelestai, also can mean, "It is paid. It is done. It is complete. I have done what I came to do." Not only the physical suffering, but the spiritual suffering about which we can know little, in which somehow or other Jesus became a sacrifice for human sin and guilt, accumulated along the ages and, in some sense, that we cannot really fully understand, put upon him. And as a young Christian, at one of the places I used to go to, we used to sing a chorus, really old-fashioned now, but nonetheless, it's got great truth in it, succinctly put. It went like this: at the cross of Jesus, pardon is complete. Love and justice mingle, truth and mercy meet. Though my sins condemn me, Jesus died instead. There is full forgiveness in the blood he shed. What it means is that somehow Jesus became the sacrifice for our wrongdoing, both individually and collectively, in order that we might be forgiven, reconciled, justified, redeemed. There's a great vocabulary of words that is used. In 1436, there was a monk in Constantinople who was poking through some papers, because they were packing papers in a fish shop in Constantinople, 1436. And he discovered something that no one had ever found before. It was an epistle written about 160 AD. It's extraordinary how these things turn up. It was written to a man called Diognetus, thought to be a Roman official, by a Christian. And we have it now again, like these other documents I've talked about, in what was something called the Apostolic Fathers. And it goes like this, describing the events of the cross to this Roman official. This unknown Christian said this: he gave up his own son as a ransom for us, the Holy One for the lawless, the innocent one for the wicked, the righteous one for the unrighteous, the imperishable for the perishable, the immortal one for the mortal. What else could hide our sins but his right, the righteousness of that one? How could we, who were lawless, be made upright except by the Son of God alone? Oh, the sweet exchange, oh, the inexpressible creation, oh, the unexpected act of benevolence. All that achieved by Christ on the cross. St. Paul puts it like this in 2 Corinthians: he who knew no sin, he was innocent, he was faultless, etc., became sin that we might become the righteousness of God. The Orthodox Church has a kind of doctrine which is called theosis. He became as we are, that we might become as he is. And all this came to its, as it were, culmination, its end in the crucifixion. Peter, by now, of course, had gone away. He'd left the courtyard of the high priest. He, as we know, had wept bitterly. And he, for the next 24 hours, I suppose, from Friday afternoon, the time of the crucifixion, from noon until 3 o'clock, until Sunday morning, must have had the most extraordinarily bleak and dark time. Actually, a very good play all about that by Riding Lights, if you ever come across them, sort of working through the feelings and the thoughts of Peter during that period from Good Friday through to Easter Day, and that very early run to the empty tomb, first thing on Sunday morning. And so the story moves on, doesn't it? Where Jesus' body is taken down from the cross, a spear is thrust into his side, he is dead, because we see the separation there of his blood into the two parts of sort of water and clot, and he's known to be dead. He's taken down, he's buried in a new tomb by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus from John chapter 3, you remember. Then he's placed in the tomb. And the women, particularly Mary Magdalene and one or two others with her, is watching across, as it were, the other side of the garden, seeing what is going on as these two men place the body of Christ into the tomb. And then in John chapter 20, the story now moves on to the resurrection in John's Gospel. which brings us in just a moment to the conversation of Simon Peter with Jesus on the shores of Lake Galilee. Now, in John chapter 20, the story is firstly of the empty tomb, of its discovery by Mary Magdalene, here in St. John's Gospel, and then of 4 appearances of Jesus. One, first and foremost, to Mary herself, Mary Magdalene, the first witness to the resurrection, a woman in the garden of the tomb. And then 3 appearances of Jesus to the disciples, 2 in a room in Jerusalem, a week apart, and then sometime later on the shores of Lake Galilee. And each of those occasions of the appearance of Jesus in the garden to Mary Magdalene, then to the apostles together except for Thomas, and then a week later, and that particular conversation with Thomas could be in themselves a further conversation. And indeed, in the little book I wrote, I think I at least touch on one, the meeting of and conversation between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, because it has to be one of the most marvelous and touching stories, conversations in the whole of the New Testament. Where, as you know, Mary Magdalene mistakes Jesus for the gardener. Somehow she doesn't recognize him, doesn't expect to see him probably. Where have they taken him? She says to the gardener, thinking him to be a gardener and not Jesus. And he says, "Woman, why are you crying? Who it is you are looking for? Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will get him." Thinking his body's been stolen, grave robbers and all that. And then he says the one single word, doesn't he? He just says her name, Mary. And immediately she recognizes him, holds on to him. And Jesus says, "Don't hold on to me. I'm now, as it were, in this different form of existence, but go and tell the brethren, the disciples, that I will be meeting with them. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And so she does that. And so that's the first appearance. The second appearance on the same day in the evening in the room in Jerusalem is of Jesus to the disciples, except for Thomas. Of course, Judas is not there. He's hung himself by now, tragically. But there are the remaining 10 disciples in the upper room, and Jesus comes. They're overjoyed. He says, "Peace be with you." And then he prepares them for the future. He says, "You're going to have a message of forgiveness to preach to the whole world." He breathes upon them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit," which in fact will be fulfilled fully at Pentecost. This was like an enacted sign for them that they were to receive the Spirit, of whom he'd spoken anyhow in the upper room discourse in John chapter 14 to 16. But Thomas wasn't there. He didn't believe. You know the story well, and said, "I won't believe unless I put my hand or finger into the marks of the nails in his hands and thrust my hand into his side. Only then will I believe." Dangerous thing to say. And then only a week, or exactly a week later, Jesus appears again through a locked door, just a different body. I won't say more about that now, but we could think about that later. He suddenly appears, "Peace with you," and says directly to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting." And the theme of the gospel, believe, believe. And of course he did. He said, "My Lord and my God," as you would. And now, having gone through all of that, we come to this conversation between Jesus and Simon Peter, which is on the shores of Lake Galilee. There are 2 things by way of background to the conversation, and then I want to say 3 things in this conversation itself. The background, of course, is what I've said earlier, is the denial of the Apostle Peter of Jesus. He was so sure of himself, wasn't he, in the Last Supper? Though they all flee, I will remain, he said. I will be loyal. In the Garden of Gethsemane, like with the other disciples, he had slept and Jesus had prayed, and so he wasn't ready for the kind of battle and struggle that ensued when he stood outside a brazier in the forecourt of the high priest's house and was asked by a maid, "Aren't you one of his disciples? Didn't I see you?" Another one, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And with increasing emphasis, even using an oath, he said, "I don't know you. I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know him." And the cock crowed, and he remembered the words of Jesus. And we're told in St. Luke's Gospel that Jesus, as it were, turned when the cock crowed and looked through a window and could see Simon Peter across the yard. Their eyes must have met, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. So it's a conversation after a failure, but the wonderful thing about the Christian faith, about Christ, is that he came in the world to save failures, to redeem us, to put us back on the road again. And that was the purpose of his coming. Not that it didn't matter, but that it wasn't the end. And so Jesus comes to Galilee as he said he always would, and he told Mary Magdalene and others to tell the disciples that he would be going there. And although he'd already seen them at least on 2 occasions and possibly more, not recorded in St. John's Gospel, he now turns up on the shore of Galilee. And 7 disciples, we're told their names, or not all of their names, but most of their names, have gone fishing again. It's almost really as if the disciples have not really grasped the significance of what's happened. We would say the penny's not really dropped yet. They can't really put it all together. So much has happened so quickly, it's so extraordinary, it's so out of the ordinary. They didn't really know what it meant for them yet. But Jesus would teach them in this period of 40 days between his resurrection and his ascension. Anyhow, they'd gone out fishing, and as they had done once before in Luke chapter 5, you remember, they'd caught nothing. So they came in back, despondent, they'd useless trip. And then they saw what I like to call, because it's a well-known song, is it Stranger on the Shore, the stranger on the shore. They're not too far away now, they're coming back in, and he shouts, and he says, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" Knowing perfectly well that they hadn't got any. "No," they answered. And so he says, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." And I'm told that fishermen almost by and large threw their net on the other side of the boat as their sort of wont of how to fish. So do something different. In effect, Jesus is saying, throw your net on the right side and you'll find some. And of course they did. 153 very large fish, a hugely unusual number of fish to get in one go, in one throw of the net in Galilee. And something somewhere in the minds of one of the disciples at least began to twig, we would say. It had happened once before. And we're told in verse 7, the disciple whom Jesus loved, again we're talking about John here, said to Peter, "Look, it is the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say it's the Lord, he knew it was too, because he'd been there on the first occasion. It was indeed the time when Simon Peter was called to be a disciple, and he fell down in the boat and says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, Lord." But Jesus called him to be a fisher of men. So he remembered, didn't he? And rather charmingly, because he wasn't dressed for a meeting, he wrapped his outer garment round him, for he'd taken it off for the fishing. He jumped into the water. He ran, typically of for Peter to meet Jesus, who already had fire going on the beach, some fish on it, some bread, for a breakfast for the disciples. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. They counted them out. And they brought some, "Come and have breakfast." And it must have been, if you think about it, a most extraordinary breakfast. What do you say? What conversation might you have? Then Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. I imagine they're quiet for a time. And they ate, and they looked, and they thought. And then they'd finished eating. And Peter knew that now was the time, at least Jesus knew that now was the time to have a conversation with him. A conversation which, on the one hand, he didn't possibly want to have, but on the other hand, he knew he must have. A conversation which Jesus would have with him in order to restore him to be the apostle that he wanted him to be and had always intended him to be and would be, fulfilling his will. And so we have this extraordinary and memorable and poignant conversation between Jesus and Peter. Three things about it. Firstly, the question. Secondly, the recommissioning. And thirdly, the fulfillment of his calling. The question. The first thing I want you to notice is that there's a kind of formality about the way Jesus addresses Peter. He's become known as Simon Peter. Peter was, of course, the nickname, the name that Jesus gave him, meaning a rock. And of course, he hadn't been very rock-like at the time of his denial. Simon, his original name. But here Peter, rather Jesus addresses Peter in a formal way. He says, "Simon, son of John. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" It was the beginning of this recommissioning. And the question he asks is the fundamental question, which is, do you love me? See, what he didn't ask is this. He didn't say to him, "Do you know what went wrong?" He didn't say, why did you do it? He didn't say, "I was terribly hurt," which wasn't a question, but more of a statement. He didn't say, "Can you affirm your basis of faith and belief in me?" No, he said, "Do you love me?" Interestingly, he adds a comparison here, more than these, to make it in a way more difficult. Now, the conversation, I imagine, was in Aramaic, because that was the normal language they would have spoken, but the text that we have is in Greek, that John gives us in John. And it's interesting the way in which John has made the question, because he's used one of the great Greek words for love, which you probably know, agape, which means God's sacrificial love. Do you love me? And when Peter replies, he replies with another of the great words for love, but not quite such, if you like, such a noble word. I don't know quite the right word to use, but the word that he used here, that is John, to describe Peter's response, "You know that I love you," is philia, which is a love meaning friendship. So what John is doing there is he's crediting to Jesus this extraordinary and divine love which he has, as you see, for Peter. And Peter, who is presumably growing in his love, is given this other word with which to respond instead. A love meaning friendship. And Peter replies this in this way. He says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Now, I find it interesting that he adds in reply, those words, "you know." You know that I love you. Why? Because he, I think, has come to realize that Jesus knows him better than he knows himself. Just as Jesus predicted even before he denied that he would do this thing, so saying the cock will crow on the third time. So Jesus knows how much he loves him. He does know that he loves him. But also this is straight out, isn't it? I would say Psalm 139, verse 1, where it says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know my down sitting and my uprising. Lo, there's not a word on my lips that you don't already know." So knowing all these things now, Peter says, "You know that I love you." Yes, Lord. And on 3 times, Jesus asks the same question. And the reason, of course, that he asks it 3 times is because he overlays the 3 denials with 3 opportunities for Peter to affirm his love for Christ on 3 occasions. And on the 3rd occasion, we're told that Peter, when being asked for the 3rd time, was hurt. Verse 17, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things." That's we're emphasizing it even more, isn't he? You know that I love you. The healing was painful, but it was necessary. And Jesus had done what he intended to do, which was to restore Peter. The second part of the conversation is the recommissioning. And the recommissioning is the task that Jesus gives to Peter, which is that he is, as a result of this love for Christ, to do this thing: feed my sheep, or feed my lambs, the same thing, feed the flock of God. This is what you were called to originally, and this is what you are being recommissioned into now, is what Jesus is saying, and that is your role for the future. And that is what Peter will do thereafter. On the day of Pentecost, emboldened by the Spirit that's fallen upon him and the other apostles in that room, he will preach to the assembled company, and 3,000 people will become believers. He will become the leader of the early church, along with Paul, of course, but in particular at Antioch, he becomes the first leader of the church there, or bishop. He doesn't always get it right, as we know from one occasion where Paul sets him right. He then moved to Rome, Peter did, and there he wrote his epistles. His first epistle certainly comes from Rome. He tells Mark, the writer of St. Mark's Gospel, the story of Jesus fully, so that he can record it for his own gospel whilst in Rome. He faithfully feeds the flock of God for the rest of his life. He goes on encouraging. And that was his calling, and in many ways it's our calling at different levels within the communities we operate in, within our church, our family, our friends, to encourage them that they too might be fed the truth. Take care of my sheep. And then the last thing here in this account is that Jesus indicates the cost of his calling, particularly to Peter. Very truly, he says in verse 18, "I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." In verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God That's, if you like, an editorial bit from John, isn't it, in the middle there? Because by the time he's written his gospel, this has happened. He wrote his gospel probably in 90 AD, and it's almost certain that Peter died a martyr's death in Rome during the reign of Nero, around about AD 64 or a bit before, where many Christians died in a persecution either before or following a great fire in Rome. And Peter, at that point, I don't know whether he had taken that on board, probably not. It was not easy language to completely understand immediately. Turned and he saw the Apostle John and said, "What about him?" What's going to happen to him? Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following him. And when Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" It's such a natural human thing to do, isn't it? What's going to happen to him? You told me, as far as I understand it, that this is my future, and obviously it's very costly. And Jesus, in effect, said, "Don't worry about him. What happens to him is another matter. As far as you're concerned, follow me, follow me." And I think that's such a helpful thing. I find it so helpful. Don't be concerned about what's happening with somebody else, some other person, maybe who's close to you, some other Christian leader you might admire. No, get on and do and fulfill your own calling. Go on following him. And that is what, of course, Peter did thereafter. And so this gospel concludes with this epilogue, and it's a sign of the future, because this whole miracle, the great catch of fish, and then this recommissioning of Simon Peter is, if you like, a preparation for the church to go into the world for a great harvest, indicated by the symbolism of the great catch of fish. And together to bring in that harvest. And many people who will be involved in that are, like Peter, just ordinary, sometimes broken, sinful human beings whom God wants to use. So this is the final conversation, and time is up. So thank you for listening. And with this conversation, the gospel closes.